Look at your handout and you see these two quotes that I put next to each other. And let me explain why I did this. The first one is by a philosopher, an atheistic philosopher who died in 1960, Albert, that's pronounced Camus. And he wrote this. He wrote, basically, at the bottom of life, which seduces us all, I think what he means by that is we're all trying to figure out what is at the bottom of life. What's the basic explanation for things? There is only absurdity and more absurdity. What he's saying is when you search and try to figure out what is life all about, he says it's pointlessness, meaningless, and the more you search, the more you realize that it's all meaningless. Now, there's another philosopher, another atheist philosopher that put it this way. He agrees with Camus. He says this, in the light of the tyranny of randomness, this is what he calls the world, the tyranny of randomness. The best people can do is here's what this philosopher says, is to worship the shrine that his own hands have built, undismayed by the empire of chance, to preserve a mind free from the wanton tyranny that rules his outward life. What he's saying, these guys are saying, everything's chaos, everything's random, so the best we could do is create our own meaning, or at least surrender to the absurdity of life and say, oh, it doesn't matter, I'm just going to create my own meaning. Now, put that in contrast to the way Solomon ends his reflection on the absurdity of life and says, wait, there is a God, and he's going to definitively say, that was right, this was wrong. He's the judge of all things. So everything is not ultimately absurd and not ultimately random because God is sovereign over all. He's the ultimate judge. Now, I take great comfort in that. What a difference. Both Albert Camus and both Bertrand Russell, they look at the same data that Solomon looked at, the same events, the same observations, and they both saw, oh, things seem pointless, things seem random, but they came to such different conclusions. Why is it that Solomon could come to the conclusion after observing the seeming randomness and pointlessness of life that, hey, it really is worth living, there really is a direction to things, and yet these guys go away and say, it doesn't matter. Create your own meaning. How is it that they can see the same data and yet diverge in such dramatically different directions? Well, we're going to discover that as we look at what Solomon means by vanity of vanities. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to go this morning. First of all, we're going to ask the question, how is vanity emphasized throughout the book of Ecclesiastes? How does Solomon bring it to its such a poignant statement here? What does vanity really mean? What does Solomon say about vanity? Why is everything not really vanity? And finally, what can we learn from the theme of vanity? That's where we're going here, just so you know where we're after. So first of all, how is vanity emphasized? Well, it occurs 38 times throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. I have 37 there, but it's actually 38, okay? It's 38 times. And I counted really carefully and discovered I had made a mistake, but I didn't update it on the PowerPoint there. Just so you know, I actually listed it out for you, and there is actually a mistake I made on your handout too. Under, you see chapter 5, verses 6 and 9 for the reference there. It should actually be chapter 5, verses 7 and 10. Okay, so those are the actual references in which you'll find vanity occurring. Chapter 5, verses 7 and 10. And other than that, if it's all right, those are the 38 times that vanity occurs in Ecclesiastes. And so he emphasizes it by repeating that word over and over again. In the second verse of Ecclesiastes, he has it 5 times. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he also emphasizes it by this expression, this superlative expression. The way to understand this is you look at the word super. Okay, he's making this a super expression. How is he doing that? He's saying vanity of vanities. You can think of some other superlative expressions throughout Scripture, like holy of holies. One of the other titles of the book of Song of Solomon is the Song of Songs. Okay, what is meant by the Song of Songs? What is meant by that is, this is the best song ever. This is the song. The most beautiful, the most lyrical, the most compelling song. It's a Song of Songs. What about the Holy of Holies? This is the most holy place ever. Okay, that's a superlative expression. What is he saying? Vanity of vanities. The most vain thing ever. See, he's emphasizing it not only by the number of times it occurs throughout the book, but he's also emphasizing it by the superlative expression. He can't get any more intense than that. Vanity of vanities. It's all absolutely vanity. So what does this actually mean? What does it mean that all is vanity? Well, the word vanity, the English word vanity translates the Hebrew word, I'll say it for you, havel, which literally means breath or vapor. Breath or vapor. So if we translated this literally, it'd be something like this. Breathiness of breathinesses. All is breathiness. Now that kind of sounds funny. But what is meant by that? Well, you think about what is a vapor? What is a breath? It's just a puff of something that appears just for a little short time, then it's gone, right? So maybe we can replace the word, instead of like breath or vapor, what about transient? Okay, you know what transient means? Temporary or fleeting. So let's see if we can put transient in place of vanity and see if it makes sense. So let's do that with chapter 6 and verse 12. So open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes and look at chapter 6 and verse 12. Okay, this is what Solomon says here. For who knoweth what is good for man in this life, all the days of his, what does it say there, vain life? What if we put transient there? Would that make sense? All the days of his fleeting life. Yeah, I think that really makes sense because life is temporary. What about 11:10? Go to chapter 11 and verse 10 and see if this idea transient or temporary makes sense in chapter 11, verse 10. Therefore, remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are what? Transient. They're fleeting. Does it make sense to say that childhood and youth are temporary? Well, it makes absolute sense. It just goes by. It's temporary. So, yes, this idea of a breath or vapor, it's just something that puffs and it's gone. It really makes sense to understand vanity in that way. But there are some ways Solomon uses this word that doesn't quite fit this temporary or transient nature of things. Go to chapter 2 and verse 15. Chapter 2, verse 15. Solomon says, Then said I in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth to me. And why was I then more wise? This is the verse that I referred to earlier when he said, one person lives his life as wisely as possible. Another person lives his life as foolishly as possible. And yet, what end do they both meet? They both die. And Solomon looks at that and says, this is transient? You see, it doesn't quite make sense to put that word there. A word that might make more sense is pointless, right? That was pointless. So we see here what's going on is Solomon is using both the idea of impermanence or temporary transience as a way of saying this is leading to the pointlessness of things. So he has both the idea of impermanence, transience, and pointlessness in his discussion here of vanity. So what does vanity mean here? Here's what we can say. When he says that everything is vanity, in addition to saying that it's all impermanent, he's saying this, that everything is transient, everything is fleeting, and everything fails to contribute toward a satisfying experience and understanding of life. Everything fails to contribute toward a satisfying and a sensible understanding of life. Okay, well, that's what it means. What does he say about it? Well, first of all, it's important for us, very important for us, and I don't want us to lose this as we look at this whole discussion, is the scope of vanity. What is everything he's calling vanity? Well, it's everything under the sun And this also is an important theme throughout Ecclesiastes. If we miss this, we'll miss what Solomon means, okay? This is where, when people miss this theme, this is where they misinterpret Ecclesiastes. He's talking about everything under the sun, and we know how important this theme is, first of all, by how often he repeats it, 29 times throughout Ecclesiastes. So what does he mean by under the sun? Life under the sun is life as we know it. The world and mankind in their current fallen state. Okay? Life and mankind in their current fallen state. This is what the world looks like right now, with sin and perversion and distortions and everything wrong with life. That's life under the sun. And so life under the sun is the scope of Solomon's observation. He said, I looked at everything under the sun, and I concluded nothing ultimately contributes toward a satisfying experience of life. Nothing ultimately contributes toward a satisfying understanding of life. Life under the sun is pointless because it's the world and mankind in their current fallen state. There are parallels of life under the sun to New Testament authors, like when John says in 1 John 2:17, you see that bullet point under the scope of vanity. The world is passing away. There's this transience, this impermanence, this pointlessness, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abides forever. The fashion of this world, this is what Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 7:31. The same idea, the fashion of this world, the outward appearance of everything, it's all going away. He calls it in Romans 12:2, this age. Okay, don't be conformed to this age. It's passing, it's fleeting, it's impermanent, right? These are different ways that New Testament authors are referring to what Solomon meant by life under the sun, life as we know it, mankind and the world in their current fallen state. That's the scope of vanity. And trying to make sense, ultimate sense of life under the sun is as pointless as trying to understand what a key is if you've never seen a lock. Okay? If you knew nothing about locks and doors and mechanical ways of capturing things, and you picked up a piece of metal that was smooth on one side and rigid on the other side, and you're trying to figure out, well, what is this thing? Well, maybe it's good for opening boxes, which I admit I've used my keys for before, but that doesn't explain this very specific ridgy pattern here. Maybe it's like a piece of jewelry, like a necklace. But you're like, well, it's not really beautiful. It's not symmetrical. What is this for? Why this ridge here? And why? There's no specific reason that you could make sense of until you understand this fits a lock and it serves a purpose. Trying to understand this life under the sun is as pointless as trying to figure out a key unless you know what a lock is. Trying to understand why injustice? Why do I have this longing for things that last? Why do I have an appreciation of beauty? Why do I have some sense of truth? Why do I have some sense of morality? Okay, why on the one hand do I long for the good, yet do evil? It's like these ridges, like of a key in my heart, and I don't understand what it fits until I realize I was made for God. And God made this world. You can't figure out life without God in the picture. That's why Solomon says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. All is pointless, senseless. It's like trying to figure out what a key is without knowing what a lock is. What does he see vanity in? Instances of vanity. Well, he sees vanity, as I say there, in the cycles of nature. You see the wind circling around and around. You see the water flowing into the sea. It does not fill. He sees vanity in the elusive satisfaction of wealth, in toil, in seeing and hearing, the lack of lasting memories of things, and people, and injustice. He surveys all these things, and he says it's pointless, it's vanity. It doesn't serve any ultimate purpose. And here's how he assesses it. He looks at this and says, this is just a great evil. This is bad. It has this sort of withering effect on our hearts. Does Solomon offer any explanation for it? Or does he just say, it's all bad, it's all vain? Well, we see throughout Ecclesiastes that yes, he does explain it. Let me flip here. What is his response to it? I skipped that point. His response to vanity is grief and a hatred for work and life. Okay, so personal response to vanity, grief and hatred. When we look at life under the sun, when we this is what Solomon said after he recounts his building of great works and doing these great accomplishments. It was while he was working on it and while he was in the midst of it that he was happy and that he was fine with it. But as soon as he stepped back and folded his arms and looked at it and reflected, he thought, it's all going away. It's not going to last. This was vain. It was pointless. And then he said, I hated life and I hated work. I think I told you this last week. I was running with a man last Saturday, and he was a middle-aged guy, and he said, I look at my early career, and I realized that I was so ambitious and working for things, and now that I'm reaching that midpoint, he was having some struggles in life, and I realized that we're all going to end up in a nursing home anyway. This is as far as I know, this is an unbeliever. He said, we're all just going to end up in nursing home. So what's the point? Like, why? He was echoing the sentiment of Solomon and Ecclesiastes when he said, I worked so hard and I did all this. And as soon as I stop and reflect, I realize, well, what's the point? Why did I do all this? And it's a great evil. And so if you just look at life under the sun, your response will be, I hate this. I hate work. I hate life. Why is it all vanity? Well, Solomon's mantra, this is an explanation for vanity, that all is vanity is his reflection on the devastating effects of the fall. This is what life looks like when this world has been twisted by sin. It doesn't make sense like it should. It's not satisfying like it should. It perplexes us. And he's really reflecting on life as it's been impacted by the fall. And this is the way Paul puts it in Romans. The wages of sin, the effect of sin is what? It's death. And so Solomon is reflecting both on the ultimate cause of pointlessness and that which is sin and what sin has brought about into this world. Sin is injected into the human race, death. And so there's an expiration date on everything now. And because of death, sin, the effect of sin, in the blank there goes death, which results in the pointlessness of life. He puts it, death levels everyone, including man and beasts. Life under the sun means that one's labor gets transferred to another. So why did I work so hard to get it if someone else is going to get inherited after I do? It makes work pointless, cancels out any satisfaction or achievements people gained on earth. That's what death does. And so what he concludes is the most thorough observation of earthbound existence, which is life under the sun, will reveal nothing of ultimate worth or meaning, since death renders every accomplishment and experience utterly pointless. Wow, that's kind of a morbid statement. Keep in mind, he's observing life under the sun. Okay, this is life in its fallen state as we know it. Okay, now here's the twist. Here's the exciting turn in the trail. Solomon's statements of vanity come when he is observing everything under the sun. So, everything is not really vanity. Everything is vanity only without God in the picture. That's what goes in the blank there. In other words, when Solomon says everything's pointless, vanity of vanity, all is vanity under the sun, he's saying everything is vanity unless you put God in the picture. Because when Solomon talks about God, things aren't pointless. He says things like this: God is going to make everything beautiful in his time. God is going to bring everything into the right judgment in his time. Every secret thing. So God's works are forever. When Solomon says everything a man does, it goes away as far as his experience is concerned. He passes on his wealth to someone else. What God does is forever. Even when we don't understand what he's doing, and even when he works on his timetable and not ours. I wish we had the time to look at each of these passages that reinforce what's saying here. But it is so important to understand that even though life under the sun yields an observation or conclusion that everything is cycling and spiraling toward pointlessness, yet God is doing something, and he's making everything beautiful in his own time, even when we can't see it. God's works are forever and beautiful. God himself is the source of satisfaction, even though his gifts don't satisfy in himself. And that's why it's so important when you think about enjoying life. Solomon says that he gives the example of a man who was given honor and wealth, and yet God withheld from him the ability to enjoy it. Talk about a feeling of pointlessness when you think at the end of your life, I've accumulated all these things and yet I don't have any satisfaction from it. And yet Solomon says, if you enjoy the pleasures that God gives you, the relationships, the food, as simple and basic as food, as simple and basic as work, you enjoy these as from the hand of God. They don't in themselves offer satisfaction. How are they satisfying? Insofar as you recognize them as gifts from God. We tend to turn God's gifts into our idols, don't we? We worship and serve the created thing instead of the Creator. And that's when things get utterly agonizing and perplexing and frustrating for us. Because we look at you, I want to find satisfaction in my career. And God says, you're never going to find satisfaction in that. But if you work and do your job and enjoy it as a gift from the hand of God, that's where satisfaction comes. Because God is the giver of pleasure and satisfaction. Satisfaction is not found in God's gifts, but in God himself. And finally, God's judgments are right and true even when he works on his timetable and not ours. This is something that I think about when I see crimes in the news. I know this is I think it was the second anniversary recently of the Boston Marathon bombing. You remember that? I don't know why, but that in particular, the picture of that little boy that was killed in that bombing, it brings me to tears almost every time I see it. To think that there is this boy innocently standing and cheering on his dad to finish this marathon, and then he gets just blown up by this random, senseless act of evil. And our initial response is, we want justice, right? Execute that criminal. Okay, so what if you execute him? Is that going to bring justice? Is that going to make things right? You see how our whole longing for justice itself points to the need for a God who's going to ultimately bring everything into judgment. Judgment cannot be meted out ultimately on this earth. We long for a judgment that really rights the wrongs. And if you seek justice in this life alone, then you're seeking something that you'll ultimately be frustrated and perplexed by. God's judgments are right and true. God is going to vindicate the righteous, and he's going to condemn the wicked. And we can take comfort in that. And let me just add this as a side note. We can take comfort in that only if we are in Jesus Christ. Because apart from Christ, we are the objects of God's judgment and wrath, right? It drives us to Christ. Okay. That's why everything is not really vanity. Now, what can we learn from this theme of vanity? Remember that Solomon, he concludes the whole book with saying, here's the whole duty of man. It's to fear God and keep his commandments. And by relentlessly emphasizing that nothing in life will yield certain meaning or ultimate satisfaction, he's forcing us to see our need for God. That's what this whole vanity theme is meant to do. It's meant to drive us to God. Yes, life under the sun is ultimately pointless. It's vain. That's why you need God. God is going to evaluate things in the end. He's going to say to some things, that's good. To other things, that's bad. He's going to make everything beautiful as a time. And here's the first thing we could learn from this theme of vanity. Life makes no sense apart from God. Life makes no sense apart from God. And I'll refer again to 1 John 2:17 when John says, this world is passing away. Now, atheistic philosophers and thinkers, they believe that too. They believe that everything is going to ultimately end in heat death. But they don't believe the next part, but he that doeth the will of God abides forever. You see how pointless our existence is if it's not for God and immortality? Life makes no sense apart from God. A commentator put it this way: the Christian answer is that the universe does make sense. There is a plan and purpose that has its center and climax as Christ. In Christ, we as Christians have been predestinated to be an integral part of that plan. We have been created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God afore prepared that we should walk in them. But not even as Christians has it been given to comprehend that whole plan. We trust God that for those that love God, all things work together for good. Here's the second thing we could learn. Since sin is the ultimate cause of misery, the conquering of sin is the only cause for our joy. Think about this carefully. Some people, I read a few weeks ago about there was this guy who wrote this history of the world, and then he was so arrogant, or I don't know what to call it, but he tried to project not just the history, but the future of the world. And he's saying, he's making guesses about how we're going to evolve. And he really thinks that we're going to figure out this immortality thing. He really thinks we're going to figure out how to live forever. Now, if people end up figuring out how to live forever, would that turn our world into heaven? If people live forever without God in their sin, that would not be heaven. That would be hell. Because we need, first of all, our sin to be taken care of. Because like we said earlier, sin is the cause of death. That's why Jesus Christ came to conquer sin and then rose from the dead to conquer death. That's why Paul asked the rhetorical question at the end of chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, "O death, where is your sting?" It's gone because Jesus Christ has removed that by conquering sin. Here's the third one. And I need to edit what I have on your handout, because what I reflected on it this morning and I realized it wasn't quite right. To say, this is what I should say, what's on the PowerPoint is what should be correct. So if you want to correct that on your handout, I'd rather it say this. To say I don't understand how this fits is to admit our finiteness. That's true. That's what Solomon was admitting. I don't understand how everything fits. That's okay to say that. Sometimes as Christians, we like to try to be God's public relations liaison and try to defend God's actions and say, oh, there's a purpose for that, and I could see it. And the reason why I spilled my coffee on me this morning was because if I hadn't been late, then I would have gotten in a wreck. And that's how we kind of justify God's sovereignty. No, it doesn't always work that way. Some things God brings into our lives, and we just are perplexed by it. There are some people, there are some of you right now, and you are facing a circumstance in your life, and you're thinking, God, I don't understand how this fits. Here's a piece, this is a puzzle piece, and it looks so dark and scary, and it doesn't fit with the others, and God, please help me understand. But God doesn't guarantee you that you'll understand it. But here's what you can say. I know that God is doing something with me. I know that this somehow fits into a plan of God that I can't see. To say, I don't understand how this fits, is to admit our finiteness, our frailty, our limited perspective. But on the other hand, to say, this isn't going anywhere, this doesn't fit at all, is to assert our faithlessness. 4, we must never seek for ultimate satisfaction under the sun. That is the ultimate cause of our misery, is when we just try to extract and squeeze from our experiences joy and happiness. And God says, it's never going to happen, because ultimate satisfaction comes from God. Here's another point, and this is one of the reasons why I want the points of this series, is to help you use this as an evangelistic tool. We may compassionately help unbelievers see the despair and pointlessness of life without God. People that are seeking satisfaction and frustration, and they say, I don't understand, this doesn't make any sense. You say, no, of course not, because God's not in the picture. And finally, and triumphantly, only Jesus can break us free from the pointlessness of life by his death and resurrection. And I encourage you to go to Romans chapter 8 and see where Paul says that all this creation has been subjected to vanity, to pointlessness, and yet Jesus Christ, he breaks the bond of sin and death. And now we have the confidence that it's not all pointless. It's going somewhere. God's going to make everything beautiful in his time. And in contrast to the pointless spiral of life under the sun, Jesus, the death of Christ and his resurrection has brought about something genuinely new. This is great. Solomon in chapter 1 says, is there anything you could point to in this world and say, see, this is new, it's not happened before? And we can point to the resurrection of Christ and says, yes, there is. 2 Corinthians 5:17, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. And eventually, God's going to make all things new in a place where we will dwell with God in perfection. We'll see his face, and he'll dwell with us. He'll be our God, we'll be his people.